A wealthy man hires a homeless woman to bear his child, but when the baby is born, he is stunned by what he discovers. In the heart of bustling New York City, a chance encounter between two unlikely individuals sets the stage for a life-changing journey. Ethan Blackwood, a man who thrives on control and precision, makes an unusual proposition to Emma Carter, a struggling artist with a past full of challenges. What begins as a calculated agreement soon unravels into something far more complex, testing their boundaries, beliefs, and the very essence of what it means to trust someone. As their worlds collide, secrets are revealed, emotions flare, and unexpected connections form. But can two people from such different paths truly find common ground? And what happens when the lines between responsibility and genuine care begin to blur? This is a story of transformation, resilience, and the unpredictable twists of fate. What will they discover about themselves and each other when everything they thought they knew is challenged? Ethan Blackwood was a man who had mastered the art of control. At 42, he was at the pinnacle of success, commanding respect and fear in equal measure within the cutthroat world of New York real estate. From his pristine office on the top floor of a glass skyscraper, Ethan surveyed the city with a sense of triumph. Yet, amidst his empire of power and wealth, there was a void he could not ignore. Legacy was all that mattered now, a successor to carry forward his name and empire. But relationships, in his experience, were messy, unpredictable, and always fraught with complications. He had tried twice, both marriages crumbling under the weight of his relentless ambition. Love, he concluded, was an illusion, but an heir? That was an investment. Determined to avoid the entanglements of traditional family life, Ethan formulated a plan. He would find someone to carry his child, bound not by emotion but by contract. It would be a transaction like any other he had perfected in business. Clean, controlled, and binding, lawyers would draft the terms, ensuring that all parties understood their roles. All he needed now was to find someone willing to accept the offer. That afternoon, Ethan left his office early, a rare occurrence that surprised even his assistant. He took his sleek black town car into the heart of the city, his mind preoccupied with how to approach this unconventional task. He didn't trust dating apps or social connections for this endeavor. It had to be discreet, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain. As his car weaved through the bustling streets of Soho, his gaze wandered. At a red light, near an upscale art gallery, his attention was caught by a young woman sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk. Her messy auburn hair framed a face that was both weary and defiant. She was sketching on a tattered piece of paper, her movements deliberate despite the noise and chaos around her. Ethan's sharp eyes picked up details others might miss. The precision in her lines, the concentration in her gaze. Her clothes were worn, and the soles of her sneakers nearly split. Yet there was an air of determination about her. The light turned green, but Ethan didn't move. His driver glanced back uncertainly before Ethan snapped out of his thoughts and motioned for him to drive. A few blocks later, he instructed the driver to park. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling of the car. What had drawn his attention to her? She wasn't the type of person he typically noticed. Yet, her presence lingered in his mind. After a moment of deliberation, Ethan instructed his driver to turn back. When they arrived at the corner, the young woman was still there, crouched over her paper, entirely absorbed in her work. This time, Ethan stepped out of the car. "Excuse me," he called, his voice cool and commanding. The woman looked up, her blue eyes narrowing as she sized him up. She didn't move immediately, her expression wary. "I don't have all day," Ethan added, his tone firm. "Come here." With evident reluctance, she stood, gathering her paper and charcoal pencil. She approached slowly, keeping her distance, her posture defensive. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Ethan studied her up close now, noting the thinness of her frame and the weariness in her features. She had likely been homeless for a while, yet there was a spark in her that piqued his interest. "Get in the car. I have a proposition for you," he said, his tone neutral. The woman let out a sharp laugh. I'm not that kind of girl, if that's what you're thinking. Ethan's expression hardened. Don't be ridiculous. This isn't about that. Now, get in the car or stay here in the cold. The choice is yours. She hesitated, her eyes flicking between him and the luxury car behind him. It was clear she didn't trust him, but the cold wind biting at her skin seemed to make the decision for her. She nodded once and stepped toward the car. The ride was silent, the tension thick between them. Ethan observed her out of the corner of his eye as she stared out the window, clutching her sketch pad like a lifeline. When they arrived at a quiet cafe far from the bustling streets, he gestured for her to follow. Inside, Ethan chose a secluded corner booth. The woman sat across from him, her arms crossed defensively. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she replied curtly. "Emma Carter." "Well, Emma," Ethan began, his voice calm but authoritative, "I'm going to make you an offer that could change your life." Emma raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And what kind of offer would a man like you have for someone like me?" Ethan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to have my child." Her reaction was immediate. She burst into incredulous laughter, drawing the attention of a few patrons nearby. "You're kidding," she said, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." "I'm not kidding," Ethan replied, his tone serious. "This is a business arrangement. I will provide everything you need during the pregnancy: housing, medical care, financial support. Once the child is born, you'll be compensated generously, enough to start over and never worry about money again." Emma stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "You think you can just buy someone to do something like this?" Ethan didn't flinch. Don't waste time, Emma. You need help. I need an heir. This is mutually beneficial." Her laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence. She looked down at her hands, her mind racing. The offer was outrageous, almost insulting, but he wasn't wrong. Her life was a constant battle for survival. Still, the idea of giving up a child, even one conceived under such cold circumstances, churned her stomach. "And if I say no?" she asked, testing his resolve. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Then you go back to the streets and continue scraping by. But if you say yes, you get a chance to change everything." Emma bit her lip, torn between anger and desperation. Her pride told her to walk away, but the weight of her situation kept her rooted in place. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, as if expecting the response. "You have 24 hours. After that, the offer's off the table." Without another word, he stood and left the cafe, leaving Emma alone to wrestle with the decision that could alter her life forever. The car pulled up in front of Ethan Blackwood's luxury high-rise on the Upper East Side, its sleek exterior glittering under the city lights. Emma Carter stared at the massive building through the car window, clutching her tattered sketch pad against her chest. Her stomach churned with a mix of apprehension and disbelief. Just 24 hours ago, she had been sitting on a cold sidewalk, trying to sketch to distract herself from her hunger and exhaustion. Now, she was stepping into a world that couldn't have been further from her reality. Ethan opened the car door and gestured for her to step out. "Welcome to your new home for the next few months," he said matter-of-factly. His tone was devoid of warmth, more like a tour guide than a man inviting someone into his personal space. Emma hesitated before stepping out onto the immaculate pavement. She looked up at the towering structure, its reflective glass exterior making it impossible to see inside. It felt impenetrable, just like the man standing beside her. Ethan's posture was rigid, his suit pristine, and his expression unreadable. Inside the building, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. The marble floors gleamed under bright, recessed lighting, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. The concierge greeted Ethan with a polite nod before glancing curiously at Emma, whose worn clothes and disheveled appearance stood out in stark contrast to the surroundings. Ethan didn't acknowledge the attention. He led Emma to a private elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. The silence between them was heavy as the elevator ascended smoothly. Emma shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her decision. She wasn't sure if she'd made the right choice, but it was too late to turn back now. The door slid open to reveal Ethan's penthouse, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the New York City skyline. The interior was a mix of modern minimalism and opulent luxury, with sleek furniture, abstract artwork, and pristine surfaces that looked untouched. It was immaculate, almost sterile, and Emma immediately felt out of place. "This is where you'll stay," Ethan said, leading her through the open living area. He gestured toward a hallway. "Your room is down there. It's been prepared with everything you'll need." Emma followed him reluctantly, her sneakers making soft squeaks against the polished hardwood floors. He opened the door to reveal a spacious bedroom, complete with a king-size bed dressed in crisp white linens, a sitting area by a large window, and an en-suite bathroom that was larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. "You'll have privacy," Ethan continued, his voice even and detached. "Meals will be provided, and my assistant, Laura, will ensure you have access to anything you need. Doctor's appointments have already been arranged, and you'll meet with the medical team tomorrow." Emma turned to face him, her arms crossed. "This feels more like a prison than a home," she said bluntly. Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered by her comment. "It's comfortable and functional. That's all that matters. You'll find the arrangement suits both of us if you focus on the goal." Emma wanted to argue but held back. Instead, she dropped her bag by the bed and turned to look out the window. The view was stunning, with the city stretching endlessly below. It felt surreal to be here, surrounded by luxury, yet so far removed from her own life. Ethan lingered for a moment, watching her. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said finally. "Laura will check in with you shortly." Without waiting for a response, he left the room, closing the door behind him. Emma exhaled sharply, feeling a mix of relief and unease. She sank onto the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft fabric of the comforter. It was the most comfortable thing she'd touched in years, but it didn't feel right. Nothing about the situation felt right. Laura, Ethan's assistant, arrived an hour later with a tray of food. She was a polished woman in her early 30s, with a friendly demeanor that contrasted sharply with Ethan's coldness. She placed the tray on a small table near the window and smiled. "If you need anything, just let me know," Laura said. "I'm here to make sure you're comfortable." Emma nodded but didn't respond. She wasn't in the mood to talk. After Laura left, she picked at the food, a gourmet meal of roasted chicken, vegetables, and fresh bread. It was delicious, but she couldn't enjoy it. Her mind was racing with doubts and fears. The next day, Emma was escorted to her first medical appointment. Ethan insisted on accompanying her, his presence a constant reminder of the arrangement they had entered into. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a calm and professional demeanor, conducted a thorough examination and confirmed that Emma was in good health. As they left the clinic, Emma felt a strange mix of emotions. The reality of the pregnancy was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of questions she wasn't ready to face. What would it be like to carry a child for someone else? Could she really go through with this? Back at the penthouse, Ethan disappeared into his office, leaving Emma to navigate her new environment alone. She wandered through the space, taking in the impersonal decor and the silence that seemed to echo off the walls. It was a far cry from the noisy street she was used to, and the contrast left her feeling unmoored. One evening, as Emma sat by the window sketching absent-mindedly, Ethan appeared in the living room. He stood silently for a moment, watching her work. She noticed him out of the corner of her eye, but didn't acknowledge him. "You're good at that," he said finally, breaking the silence. Emma glanced up, surprised. "At what?" "Drawing," he replied, his tone neutral. "It's precise, deliberate, like you've done it for years." Emma shrugged. "It's just something I do to get by. It doesn't mean anything." Ethan frowned slightly, as if her dismissive response didn't sit well with him. He opened his mouth to say something but thought better of it and walked away. That brief interaction left Emma feeling unsettled. She couldn't read Ethan. He was like a locked vault, giving nothing away. Yet, in that moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something human beneath his cold exterior. As days turned into weeks, Emma began to adjust to the routine, but the sense of unease never left her. She felt like a guest in a world that wasn't hers, and the weight of the agreement loomed over everything. Ethan, true to form, remained distant, focusing on his work and checking in only when necessary. Despite the tension, small moments of connection began to emerge. Ethan occasionally asked about her well-being, and Emma found herself responding honestly. She didn't trust him, but she couldn't deny that his presence was steady, even if it lacked warmth. Still, the question lingered in Emma's mind. What kind of man makes such a deal, and why had he chosen her? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew this was only the beginning. The soft hum of the city filtered through the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows as Emma Carter sat on the edge of her bed, fidgeting with a loose thread on her sweater. It had been over a month since she moved into Ethan Blackwood's luxurious home, and though she had grown accustomed to its comforts, the strangeness of her situation hadn't faded. She was carrying the child of a man she barely knew, bound by a contract that still felt as cold and transactional as the man himself. That morning, Emma had her second medical appointment. Ethan, as always, was punctual and composed when he entered the living room where she waited. His presence was as commanding as ever, his tailored suit and perfectly combed hair a stark contrast to her more casual attire. He gestured for her to follow him without a word, and together they rode in silence to the private clinic where her checkup would take place. Emma was ushered into the examination room, where the doctor greeted her warmly. Ethan stood near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, observing everything with his usual calculated demeanor. The doctor explained that today's ultrasound would provide a clearer view of the baby and give them more information about the pregnancy's progress. As Emma lay back on the examination table, she felt a mix of anticipation and unease. The doctor applied the cool gel to her abdomen and began moving the ultrasound wand across her skin. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the machine. Ethan remained motionless, his sharp gaze fixed on the monitor. "There we go," the doctor said, her voice breaking the silence. She pointed to the screen, where a grainy image began to take shape. "That's the heartbeat." The steady, pulsing sound filled the room, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was the first tangible sign of the life growing inside her. She instinctively placed a hand on her stomach, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. Ethan's reaction was more subtle, but Emma noticed his posture change. He leaned forward slightly, his expression softening in a way she had never seen before. For a moment, his usual detached demeanor faltered, replaced by something almost vulnerable. But then the doctor's voice shifted, her tone becoming more animated. "Wait a moment," she said, adjusting the wand. "It looks like there's another one." Emma's eyes widened. "Another one?" The doctor smiled, nodding. "Congratulations. You're having twins." The news hit Emma like a tidal wave. She turned her head to look at Ethan, whose stoic mask was momentarily broken by a flicker of surprise. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke, the sound of two distinct heartbeats echoing in the room. "Twins," Emma repeated, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was thrilled or terrified, or perhaps both. Ethan finally straightened, his expression unreadable once again. "Are they healthy?" he asked the doctor, his voice calm but with a slight edge of tension. "They look perfect," the doctor assured him. "Strong heartbeats and good development." The rest of the appointment passed in a blur for Emma. By the time she was back in the car with Ethan, her mind was still racing. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, trying to gauge his reaction, but his face was as composed as ever. "They'll need more care," Ethan said abruptly, breaking the silence. "I'll ensure the medical team adjusts accordingly." Emma frowned. "That's all you're thinking about? Logistics?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression cool. It's my responsibility to plan for every possibility. This changes things, but it doesn't alter the agreement. His words stung, though Emma wasn't sure why. She turned her head to look out the window, biting back the urge to argue. She had known from the beginning that this was a business arrangement, but the sound of the twins' heartbeats had awakened something inside her that she couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, the news of the twins began to reshape their dynamic in subtle ways. Ethan, who had previously kept his distance, started appearing more often during her meals or her quiet moments in the living room. His questions about her health became more specific, and though his tone was still formal, there was a trace of genuine concern that hadn't been there before. One evening, as Emma was sketching on the terrace, Ethan joined her unannounced. He stood silently for a moment, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "Have you thought about names?" he asked suddenly. Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Names? No, I haven't." "You should," he said simply. "It's an important decision." She set down her pencil and turned to face him. "And what about you? Have you thought about what happens after they're born?" Ethan's jaw tightened and he hesitated before responding. "They'll be cared for. That's all that matters." Emma shook her head, frustrated. "You talk about them like they're assets, not people." "They're my responsibility," he countered, his tone firm. "I don't let emotions cloud my judgment." "Maybe you should," Emma shot back, "because this isn't just about you anymore." Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might argue, but instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone on the terrace. That night, as Emma lay in bed, her mind raced with questions. The sound of the twins' heartbeats played over and over in her head, a constant reminder of the life growing inside her. She wondered if she was strong enough to go through with the agreement, to hand them over and walk away. The following morning, Emma found a small package waiting for her outside her room. Inside was a new set of sketch pads and a high-quality pencil set. There was no note, but she knew it was from Ethan. The gesture was unexpected, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. When she saw him later that day, she held up the sketch pads. "Thank you," she said simply. Ethan gave a small nod. "You mentioned you were running out of paper." It wasn't much, but it was enough to soften some of the tension between them. For the first time, Emma saw a glimpse of something beneath Ethan's carefully constructed facade, a man who might be capable of more than he let on. As the days passed, Emma began to notice other small changes. Ethan was still reserved, but he seemed to linger longer during their brief interactions. He asked more questions about her interests and even joined her for meals on occasion. Despite these moments, the weight of the contract loomed over them, an unspoken reminder of the lines they had drawn between themselves. Emma couldn't help but wonder how long they could maintain this fragile balance before something had to give. The twins had already begun to change everything. She just didn't know if it would be enough. The days following the revelation of the twins brought an unexpected shift in the atmosphere of the penthouse. Emma Carter couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began, but the walls that once seemed cold and impenetrable felt less daunting. Ethan Blackwood still carried himself with the same composed authority, but there was a subtle change in how he approached her. His conversations, though still formal, were more frequent, and he seemed to linger just a little longer when they spoke. One afternoon, Emma was in the kitchen sipping tea and flipping through one of the sketch pads Ethan had given her. It had been weeks since the gift arrived, and she was still unsure what to make of it. He didn't seem like the type to offer kindness without a purpose. As she doodled absent-mindedly, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his presence catching her off guard. "I see you're using the sketch pads," he said, his tone neutral as he walked into the room. Emma glanced up, nodding. "They're good quality, better than what I had before." "I thought you might need something more reliable," he replied, gesturing to the stool across from her. "May I?" It was the first time Ethan had asked her permission to join her in the kitchen. Normally, his presence came with an unspoken authority that assumed compliance. Emma nodded, unsure what he wanted but curious enough to let him stay. He sat down, resting his elbows on the counter. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and Emma returned to her sketch, though her attention was divided. "You've been quiet lately," Ethan said finally. "I assume everything is fine?" Emma set down her pencil and looked at him. "You mean physically?" "Yes, I'm fine. The babies are fine. But that's not really what you're asking, is it?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her. "What do you think I'm asking?" She folded her arms across her chest, leaning back in her seat. "I think you want to know if I decided to stay within the lines of your perfect little plan, or if I'm about to become a problem for you." His expression didn't falter, but Emma thought she saw the faintest hint of discomfort in his eyes. "I don't consider this a perfect plan," he said evenly. "It's practical, efficient, but it's not perfect." "Why do you always hide behind logic?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "You're human, Ethan. These babies on a spreadsheet, and I'm not just a line item on some checklist." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. His gaze shifted to the sketch pad in front of her, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. Then, without warning, he stood up and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets as he stared out at the city below. "When you've lived your life the way I have," he said quietly, "logic is the only thing that keeps the chaos at bay." Emma frowned, surprised by the admission. She didn't know much about Ethan's life beyond his reputation as a cold and calculating businessman. But there was a vulnerability in his tone that caught her off guard. "You think emotions are chaos?" she asked. "Not think," he replied, turning back to face her. "I know. Every time I've let emotions dictate my actions, it's led to failure. So I stopped letting them in." Emma studied him for a moment, her frustration giving way to curiosity. "That sounds lonely." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't refute her words. Instead, he nodded toward the sketch pad. "What are you working on?" She hesitated before sliding the pad across the counter toward him. It was a rough sketch of a mother holding 2 infants. Their features undefined, but their bond unmistakable. Ethan picked it up, his expression unreadable as he studied the lines. "This is different," he said finally, his voice softer than she expected. "It's how I feel," Emma admitted, her tone guarded. "Or at least, how I think I'll feel when they're born." Ethan placed the sketch pad back on the counter, his movements deliberate. "They'll be taken care of," he said, his voice returning to its usual steadiness. "You won't have to worry about that." Emma sighed, shaking her head. "That's not what I'm worried about, Ethan." Before he could respond, Laura entered the kitchen with a folder in hand. "Mr. Blackwood, the contracts for the new development are ready for your review," she said, her tone professional but warm. Ethan nodded, taking the folder from her. "Excuse me," he said to Emma, his demeanor shifting back to the businessman she was used to. After he left, Emma sat in silence, staring at the spot where he had stood. For all his control and composure, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan than he let on. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. The sketch of the mother and twins sat on her bedside table, a reminder of the emotions she was trying so hard to navigate. The agreement was clear. She would give up the babies after they were born, but the idea of letting them go felt increasingly impossible. The following day, Ethan surprised her by suggesting they take a walk in the private garden on the building's rooftop. It was a rare moment of spontaneity from him, and Emma agreed, curious about what he had in mind. The garden was beautifully maintained with manicured hedges, vibrant flowers, and a small fountain that provided a soothing backdrop of running water. Ethan walked beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Emma stopped, turning to face him. "Because I didn't have a choice," she said honestly. "Because I was desperate." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And now," she said, meeting his gaze, "I'm not so sure." He raised an eyebrow. "Not sure about what?" "About whether I can just walk away when this is over," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "About whether I'm strong enough to do what this contract demands." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I told you from the beginning that this would be a clean arrangement," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I know," Emma said, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. But clean doesn't mean easy. For the first time, Ethan seemed at a loss for words. They stood in silence, the sound of the fountain filling the space between them. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice quieter. "I don't want you to suffer, Emma. That's not my intention." She looked at him, searching for sincerity in his expression. "Then what is your intention, Ethan? Because I can't figure it out." He didn't answer immediately, and when he finally did, his words were measured. "I want to create something lasting, something that matters. That's all I know." Emma sighed, turning away from him. "You can't create something that matters without feeling something for it, Ethan." As they continued their walk, the tension between them remained, but there was a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. For all their differences, they were both grappling with the same reality. The twins were changing everything. That night, Emma returned to her sketch pad and began working on a new piece. This time, the lines were sharper, more defined. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would figure it out together. Emma Carter sat in the corner of the penthouse living room, flipping through the pages of her sketch pad as the city lights twinkled beyond the expansive windows. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, filled with moments of unexpected warmth and lingering tension. She had started noticing the small cracks in Ethan Blackwood's cold exterior, but those moments of vulnerability only left her with more questions. What did he really feel about the twins? Or about her? Ethan had been less distant lately, joining her for meals more often and occasionally engaging in conversations that went beyond their contract. Yet, even in those moments, he maintained his characteristic composure, as if every word had been carefully calculated before it left his mouth. Emma found it frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. One morning, Laura informed Emma that Ethan would be joining her for her next medical appointment. It wasn't the first time he had attended, but it still felt odd to have him there, watching from the corner of the room with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. As they rode together in the back seat of Ethan's sleek black car, the silence between them was heavier than usual. When they arrived at the clinic, Emma was ushered into the examination room, while Ethan stayed behind to speak with the doctor. She didn't know what they were discussing, but the thought of him meddling in her care annoyed her. She wasn't a project he could manage with spreadsheets and plans, no matter how much he seemed to think otherwise. The ultrasound technician began the session, spreading the cool gel across Emma's abdomen and adjusting the wand. She turned the screen toward Emma, and the familiar sound of the twins' heartbeats filled the room. Emma's chest tightened with emotion as she watched the blurry images on the monitor. Ethan entered the room just as the technician began pointing out details. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes immediately locking onto the screen. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, though it disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. "They're growing well," the technician said cheerfully. "Both babies are right on track." Emma glanced at Ethan, expecting his usual detached response, but he surprised her. He stepped closer to the monitor, his gaze softening as he studied the screen. "They look strong," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Emma nodded, unable to hide her own smile. "They do." The ride back to the penthouse was quieter than the trip to the clinic, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't uncomfortable or heavy. It was thoughtful, almost reflective. Emma stared out the window, her hand resting on her belly, while Ethan seemed lost in his own thoughts. That evening, as Emma sat at the dining table sketching, Ethan joined her unprompted. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward her. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing it warily. "Nursery plans," he replied. Emma opened the folder and found detailed sketches and design proposals for the nursery that was being prepared for the twins. The designs were stunning, with soft colors and elegant furnishings, but they felt impersonal, like something out of a magazine rather than a real home. "It's beautiful," Emma said, running her fingers over the page. "But it doesn't feel real." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It feels like something you'd show off to a client or a guest, not a place where two babies will actually grow up." Ethan's expression shifted, and for a moment, he looked almost offended. But then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What would you suggest?" Emma blinked, surprised. "You're asking me?" "You're their mother," he said simply. "Your input matters." The weight of his words settled over her, and Emma felt an unexpected swell of emotion. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her role in such a direct way. She reached for a pencil and began sketching over the design, softening the edges and adding personal touches. A rocking chair in the corner, bookshelves filled with children's books, and colorful accents that would make the room feel warm and inviting. Ethan watched her work, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she pushed the paper back toward him. "This feels more like a nursery," she said. He studied the sketch for a long moment before nodding. "I'll make the adjustments." Emma smiled faintly. "Thanks for letting me have a say in this." Ethan met her gaze, his eyes softer than usual. "There are children, Emma. It's only right." The words caught her off guard, and she had to look away to hide the tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't sure when he had started referring to the twins as "our children," but it made her heart ache in a way she couldn't quite explain. As the days passed, Ethan continued to surprise her. He began asking more questions about her interest in her past, and while he never pried, Emma found herself opening up to him more than she had expected. She told him about her love of art, her struggles on the streets, and the dreams she had once had before life had taken a darker turn. In return, Ethan shared small glimpses of his own life. His childhood in a wealthy but emotionally distant family, his relentless drive to prove himself, and the failures that had shaped his views on relationships. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan asked, "Do you ever regret saying yes to the contract?" Emma hesitated, her hand resting on her belly. "I don't know," she admitted. "Sometimes I think about what my life would be like if I hadn't. But then I feel them move, and I know I wouldn't change anything." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I've always believed that control was the only way to ensure success. But these past few months," he trailed off, shaking his head. "What?" Emma pressed gently. He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I'm starting to realize that not everything can be controlled, and maybe that's not such a bad thing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emma felt her heart ache at the honesty in his voice. The following day, Ethan joined her for another rooftop walk. The garden had become a quiet refuge for both of them, a place where they could escape the pressure of the penthouse and the weight of the contract. As they strolled along the path, Ethan stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "I want to make sure you're comfortable here," he said. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, just tell me." Emma frowned, searching his face for the cold calculation she was used to, but she didn't find it. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" she asked. "Why are you trying so hard to make this work?" He held her gaze, his expression steady. "Because I don't want to fail them," he said simply. Emma's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw the weight of his responsibilities. Not just as a businessman, but as a father-in-waiting, and it made her see him in a new light. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma and Ethan sat on a bench in the garden. The silence between them no longer uncomfortable, but filled with a quiet understanding. The twins were changing everything, and though neither of them fully understood what the future held, they were beginning to realize that they were in this together. Emma Carter sat in the nursery, running her fingers over the delicate edge of the crib's soft quilt. The room was nearly complete now, transformed from the impersonal showroom Ethan Blackwood had initially envisioned into a warm, inviting space. The soft, neutral tones were accented with splashes of color. Emma's touch, while the shelves were lined with books and small toys. It was a room meant for two lives, two futures, and that thought filled her with a bittersweet ache. The twins weren't even born yet, but Emma already felt an unshakable bond with them. She spent hours imagining who they would be, what their laughs would sound like, what kind of personalities they'd develop. But as her belly grew, so did the weight of the contract she had signed. No matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she knew the day would come when she would have to say goodbye. Ethan had been more present lately, his focus shifting from his relentless business ventures to preparations for the twins' arrival. He still exuded control and precision, but there were moments when his actions hinted at something deeper. His growing involvement in the nursery, his insistence on attending every doctor's appointment, and his thoughtful gestures, like making sure she had her favorite tea, showed a side of him Emma hadn't expected. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Emma finally voiced a question that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "What happens if I can't walk away, Ethan?" He looked up from the contract he had been reviewing, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Emma sighed, resting a hand on her belly. "I mean, these are my children too. What if, when they're born, I can't let them go?" Ethan's expression shifted, the usual coolness giving way to something more uncertain. He set the contract down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You knew the terms when you agreed to this," he said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. "I know," Emma replied, her tone soft but resolute. "But that was before I felt a move, before I heard their heartbeats. It's different now." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, a rarity for him. Finally, he said, "I didn't plan for this to be complicated. I thought everything could be contained, but I'm starting to see that this is bigger than I expected." Emma's breath caught. It was the closest he had come to admitting vulnerability, and it made her heart ache. "You can't control everything, Ethan," she said gently. "Sometimes, you just have to let yourself feel." He met her gaze, and for a moment, the mask he always wore seemed to slip. "That's not something I've ever been good at," he admitted quietly. Their conversation lingered in Emma's mind as the days passed. She noticed Ethan making a greater effort to connect, not just with her, but with the idea of being a father. He started asking questions about parenting, even admitting that he had ordered several books on the subject. Though his approach was still methodical, Emma could tell he was trying, and that meant something. One afternoon, they were sitting together in the nursery, going over a checklist for the twins' arrival. Ethan had insisted on hiring the best pediatricians, ordering every piece of baby equipment imaginable, and assembling a staff of nannies to assist once the babies were born. "This isn't just about logistics," Emma said, glancing at the list he had handed her. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean you can't prepare for everything with a checklist," she said, her tone light but firm. "Parenting isn't like running a business, Ethan. It's messy and unpredictable." He smirked faintly. "So I've heard." Emma smiled despite herself. "You're going to have to learn to let go a little." Ethan's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the crib. "Maybe I will," he said quietly. As the weeks passed, the tension between them began to ease. They developed a rhythm, a tentative partnership that felt almost natural. Ethan continued to surprise Emma with his gestures of thoughtfulness, like ordering her favorite snacks or ensuring her room was always stocked with fresh flowers. Meanwhile, Emma found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't expected, sharing stories about her childhood and the dreams she'd once had of being an artist. One night, as Emma sat on the terrace sketching, Ethan joined her, a cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't say anything at first, simply standing beside her and looking out at the city lights. "Do you ever regret your choices?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Regret is a waste of time," he said, "but I've made mistakes. Plenty of them." Emma set her pencil down and looked at him. "Like what?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. like pushing people away, believing I didn't need anyone. And now, he turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. Now I'm starting to think I was wrong. The honesty in his voice took Emma by surprise, and she felt a pang of sympathy for him. Despite his wealth and power, Ethan seemed lonelier than anyone she'd ever met. Their conversations grew more frequent after that night, and Emma began to see glimpses of the man behind the businessman. He told her about his strained relationship with his parents, his fear of failure, and the walls he had built around himself to keep from being hurt. In return, Emma shared her own vulnerabilities, her fears about the future, her doubts about her ability to give up the twins, and the lingering pain of her past. It wasn't easy for her to open up, but Ethan listened without judgment, and that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat in the nursery going over names for the twins, Emma felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't have to walk away, where she and Ethan could find a way to make this work. But the shadow of the contract still loomed over them, a constant reminder of the boundaries they had agreed upon. And as much as Emma wanted to believe that things were changing, she couldn't ignore the possibility that Ethan might not be willing or able to let go of his need for control. The twins' arrival was drawing closer, and with it came a growing sense of urgency. Emma knew that whatever lay ahead, it would require both of them to make choices that would define not just their futures, but the futures of the two lives they had created together. The question was, would they be brave enough to face those choices together? The day began like any other in Ethan Blackwood's meticulously organized world. The penthouse was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city below and the rhythmic clicking of his pen as he reviewed documents in his office. Across the apartment, Emma Carter was in her room, folding the last of the baby clothes that had arrived earlier in the week. The twins' birth was only a few weeks away, and she could feel the weight of anticipation growing heavier with each passing day. Emma had begun to notice subtle changes in Ethan. He had been spending more time at home, stepping away from his usual 18-hour workdays to engage in conversations that seemed almost personal. She found herself wondering if he was preparing for the reality of fatherhood, or if he was merely ensuring that every aspect of his plan was executed perfectly. That morning, she felt an unusual tightness in her lower abdomen. At first, she brushed it off as one of the many discomforts of late pregnancy. But as the hours passed, the pain became sharper, more insistent, and impossible to ignore. She clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, breathing through the wave of discomfort when Laura, Ethan's assistant, walked in. "Emma, are you okay?" Laura asked, her usually calm demeanor giving way to concern. I think something's happening," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "It might be the babies." Laura immediately went into action, helping Emma to a chair and reaching for her phone. Within minutes, Ethan appeared, his expression alarmed but composed. He took one look at Emma and turned to Laura. "Call the doctor. Tell them we're on our way," he ordered, his tone sharp. Emma's breathing quickened as another contraction rippled through her. "Ethan, it's too soon," she managed to say between gasps. Ethan crouched beside her, his steady hand on her shoulder. "We're going to the hospital. They'll take care of you and the babies. Just breathe, Emma." The car ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and adrenaline. Emma clutched Ethan's hand tightly, her usual reservations about him replaced by a desperate need for stability. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he held her hand firmly, his calm presence grounding her in the chaos. When they arrived at the hospital, a team of medical staff was already waiting. Ethan had called ahead, ensuring that every detail was handled with his trademark precision. Emma was wheeled into a delivery room, where doctors and nurses moved efficiently around her, preparing for what was now inevitable. Ethan stayed by her side, his hand never leaving hers. His presence was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by a solemn intensity. For the first time, Emma saw fear in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. The hours that followed were grueling. Emma fought through wave after wave of contractions, her body pushed to its limits. Ethan remained at her side, offering words of encouragement in a voice that was steadier than she expected. "You're doing great, Emma," he said, his hand brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. She managed a weak smile between contractions. "Don't lie to me, Ethan." His lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "You're stronger than you think." The first cry filled the room, cutting through the tension like a beacon of light. The doctor held up a tiny, wriggling baby, announcing, "It's a boy." Emma's breath hitched as she watched the nurses clean and wrap the baby in a blanket. Moments later, another cry echoed, and the doctor turned with a smile. "And here's the girl." Tears streamed down Emma's face as the nurse placed the first baby in her arms. The tiny boy, with his scrunched-up face and delicate features, seemed impossibly small yet so full of life. She cradled him gently, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he stepped closer. The nurse handed him the baby girl, and he accepted her with a care that seemed foreign but natural at the same time. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop. Emma and Ethan sat side by side, each holding one of the twins, their breaths synchronized as they absorbed the enormity of the moment. "They're perfect," Ethan said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Emma nodded, unable to speak through her tears. As the medical team moved about the room, tending to Emma and the babies, Ethan remained at her side. He glanced at her, his usually sharp eyes softened by an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You did this," he said, his voice low. "You brought them into the world." Emma looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "We did this," she corrected. Later that night, Emma lay in her hospital bed, her body exhausted but her heart full. The twins had been taken to the nursery for observation, and the room was finally quiet. Ethan sat in a chair by the window, his posture uncharacteristically relaxed. "You stayed," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Of course I stayed. For someone who avoids emotions, you're doing a terrible job of staying detached," she teased gently. He didn't smile, but his gaze held hers. "They're my children, Emma. I can't detach from that." Her throat tightened at his words, and she looked away, staring at the ceiling. "And what about me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Ethan stood and walked to her bedside, his presence towering yet calm. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're not just part of a contract anymore," he said quietly. "You haven't been for a long time." Emma's breath caught, but before she could respond, the nurse entered with the twins. The moment passed, replaced by the joyful chaos of holding the babies again. In the following days, Ethan's transformation became even more apparent. He was at the hospital constantly, checking on Emma and the twins, speaking with the doctors, and even holding late-night feeding bottles when the nurses offered. Emma watched him with a mix of awe and confusion. The man who had once seemed so calculated and distant now looked at their children with a love she hadn't thought him capable of. On their last night at the hospital, Emma woke to find Ethan standing by the twins' bassinets. He wasn't speaking or moving, just watching them with a quiet intensity. She stayed silent, observing him from her bed. In that moment, she realized something she had been too afraid to admit. She wanted this to work. She wanted them to be a family. Not because of the contract, but because of the connection they had forged in the midst of uncertainty and chaos. As they prepared to leave the hospital the next morning, Ethan approached her with the twins cradled in his arms. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a depth she hadn't seen before. "Let's go home," he said simply. For the first time, Emma felt like the word home might actually mean something. As they stepped into the waiting car, the future felt uncertain but filled with possibility. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were parents, partners, and perhaps something more. The twins had changed everything. and neither of them would ever be the same again. The ride back to the penthouse was quiet, but it wasn't the same heavy silence that had defined so many of their earlier interactions. This time, the quiet felt different, thoughtful, almost tender. Emma Carter sat in the back seat with the twins cradled in her arms, their small bodies wrapped snugly in blankets. Ethan Blackwood sat beside her, his gaze alternating between the babies and the view of New York City streaming past the windows. When they arrived at the building, Ethan stepped out first, gesturing for Laura and the driver to follow with the bags and supplies the hospital had provided. Emma hesitated as she stared up at the massive structure. It was the same place she had arrived months ago, feeling like a stranger in a world she didn't belong to. But now, with the twins in her arms and Ethan standing at her side, it didn't feel as cold. Inside, the penthouse had been subtly transformed. The nursery was complete, and Laura had worked to make the living spaces feel warmer and more welcoming. Fresh flowers adorned the dining table, and the faint scent of lavender filled the air. Ethan led the way to the nursery, holding the door open as Emma stepped inside with the twins. The room was perfect. The soft light from the window bathed the space in a warm glow, and the carefully chosen furnishings created a sense of peace. Emma placed the twins in their cribs, her hands lingering on the edge as she stared at their tiny faces. Ethan stood behind her, his presence steady. "Does it meet your expectations?" he asked quietly. Emma turned to look at him, her expression soft. "It's more than I expected. Thank you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's gaze lingered on the twins, and Emma found herself wondering what was going through his mind. He had always been a man of control, someone who approached everything in life like a chessboard. But in this moment, standing in the nursery with their children, he seemed different. Over the next few days, Emma and Ethan began to settle into a routine. It wasn't easy. Sleepless nights and constant feedings tested their patience, but they worked together in a way that surprised them both. Ethan, who had once seemed incapable of genuine connection, proved to be attentive and surprisingly capable. He changed diapers without complaint, prepared bottles with the precision of a scientist, and held the twins with a tenderness that made Emma's heart ache. One night, as they sat on the couch after putting the twins to bed, Emma broke the comfortable silence. "Why did you change the nursery?" she asked, her voice curious. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because you were right. It wasn't a place for them before. It was just a design, but they deserve something more than that." Emma nodded, her chest tightening. "I never thought I'd see this side of you." He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Neither did I." Their dynamic continued to evolve, shifting from the cold, contractual arrangement they had started with to something that felt more natural. But as the days passed, Emma couldn't ignore the looming reality of the contract. It hung over her like a shadow, a reminder that everything they were building could be taken away in an instant. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Emma found herself alone in the nursery. She leaned over the crib, watching the twins sleep, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Tears filled her eyes as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Behind her, the sound of the door opening made her jump. She turned to see Ethan standing there, his expression unreadable. "Do what?" he asked, stepping into the room. Emma wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "Walk away. Give them up. It's not as simple as signing a piece of paper." Ethan crossed the room, stopping just a few feet from her. "It was never meant to be simple," he said, his voice steady but gentle. Emma's shoulders sagged as she leaned against the edge of the crib. "I thought I could do it. I thought I could treat this like a business deal, the way you do. But I can't, Ethan. They're not just part of a plan to me." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the twins, his expression softening. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "They're not just part of a plan to me either." Emma's eyes widened. "Then why are we pretending like this is all so clinical? Why are we holding on to a contract that doesn't mean anything anymore? Ethan stepped closer, his gaze locking with hers. Because I've spent my entire life believing that control was the only way to succeed. That if I let go, everything would fall apart. And now, Emma pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Now I'm starting to realize that control isn't everything. But it's not easy to unlearn something that's been part of you for so long. Emma reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Maybe it's time to let go, Ethan. For them. For us. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, with a resolve she hadn't seen before, Ethan nodded. You're right. The next morning, Emma woke to find Ethan in his office, holding the contract that had defined their arrangement. She watched silently from the doorway as he stared at the document, his jaw tight. Then, without hesitation, he tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping filled the room, and Ethan looked up to see Emma standing there. It doesn't define us anymore, he said simply. Emma's breath caught, and she stepped into the room. What does define us then? Ethan set the torn contract on the desk and walked toward her. Them, he said, gesturing toward the nursery. And us. If you're willing to give us a chance. Tears filled Emma's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. I'm willing, she said, her voice trembling. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Then let's figure it out together. As they stood in the office, the remnants of the contract scattered on the desk, Emma felt a sense of relief she hadn't known she needed. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like they were facing it as equals, as a family. The twins had changed everything, but so had Ethan. And in that moment, Emma realized that she had changed too. Together, they were ready to write a new chapter, one not defined by rules or contracts, but by love and hope. The days after Ethan Blackwood tore up the contract were a blur of new beginnings and quiet adjustments. The weight of their former agreement had lifted, but the realities of parenting twins were anything but light. Sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and the constant feeding schedule left both Emma Carter and Ethan in a perpetual state of exhaustion. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was a newfound sense of purpose, a bond that had been forged not by obligation, but by choice. Emma woke one morning to the sound of soft cries from the nursery. She stumbled out of bed, her feet dragging as she made her way down the hall. To her surprise, when she pushed open the door, Ethan was already there, holding one of the twins in his arms while gently rocking back and forth. The other baby lay in the crib, calm and content. You're up, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan glanced at her, his hair slightly tousled from sleep. So are you. Emma smiled faintly as she stepped into the room. I thought you'd delegate the midnight shifts to the nannies by now. Ethan shook his head. I didn't hire them to take my place. I want to be here for this. Her chest tightened at his words, and she walked over to pick up the other twin. The two of them stood there, side by side, rocking their children in the soft glow of the nursery light. For a moment, the exhaustion melted away, replaced by a quiet sense of contentment. The transformation in Ethan was becoming more evident with each passing day. Gone was the man who treated emotions like liabilities and relationships as transactions. In his place was someone who was learning, albeit slowly, to embrace vulnerability. He asked Emma for advice, took her suggestions seriously, and even shared his own uncertainties about parenting. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room while the twins napped, Ethan glanced at Emma over his coffee mug. What do you think we should name them? Emma blinked, caught off guard. You don't already have names picked out? He smirked faintly. I thought we should decide together. Her lips curved into a soft smile. I didn't think you were the together type. Neither did I, he admitted. But here we are. Emma leaned back against the couch, her gaze thoughtful. I've always liked the name Lily, she said after a moment. It's simple, but it feels hopeful. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. Lily it is. And for the boy? He hesitated, then said, "James, after my grandfather. He wasn't the easiest man to love, but he taught me a lot about resilience." Emma's heart ached at the rare glimpse into Ethan's past. "Lily and James," she said softly, testing the names. "I think they're perfect." As the weeks went by, Ethan and Emma began to fall into a rhythm. Their partnership, once defined by cold terms and mutual distrust, now felt natural. They shared the workload of parenting, balancing sleepless nights with moments of joy as they watched Lily and James grow. But even as things seemed to settle, Emma couldn't ignore the undercurrent of uncertainty that lingered between them. While their connection had deepened, the question of what their relationship truly was remained unanswered. Were they partners, friends, something more? One evening, as the twins slept soundly in their cribs, Emma found herself on the terrace, gazing out at the glittering New York skyline. The city that had once felt so overwhelming now seemed almost comforting, a backdrop to the life she was building. She heard the door open behind her and turned to see Ethan stepping outside, a blanket draped over his arm. "Thought you might be cold," he said, handing it to her. Emma took the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Thanks." He leaned against the railing beside her, his gaze fixed on the lights below. "I've been thinking," he began after a long silence. "Oh," Emma teased lightly. "That sounds ominous." Ethan smirked but didn't take the bait. "About us. About what we're building here." Emma's heart skipped a beat, and she turned to face him. "And what do you think we're building?" He met her gaze, his expression unusually vulnerable. "A family. At least, I hope that's what we're building." Her breath caught at his words, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had spent so much time guarding her heart, bracing herself for the possibility that Ethan would revert to his old ways. But now, looking into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. "I think we are," she said softly. Ethan nodded, as if her words were a confirmation he desperately needed. "I know I've made mistakes, Emma, and I know I've put you through a lot, but I want this to work, not just for the twins, but for us." Emma's chest tightened, and she looked away, unsure if she could trust what she was hearing. "You're asking me to believe that you've changed," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not just asking," Ethan said, stepping closer. "I'm showing you, every day, or at least, I'm trying to." She turned back to him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. But there was none. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does this matter to you so much now?" Ethan hesitated, then said, "Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I have something real, something worth fighting for, and I don't want to lose it." The honesty in his words left Emma breathless. She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "Okay," she said finally, "I'll try to." The days that followed were filled with small, quiet victories. Ethan and Emma worked together to create a home that felt warm and full of love, even in its imperfection. They read books to Lily and James, shared late-night conversations about their hopes and fears, and began to envision a future that wasn't defined by contracts or obligations. One evening, as they sat on the living room floor playing with the twins, Ethan turned to Emma. "I've been thinking about something else," he said, his tone serious. Emma raised an eyebrow, bracing herself. "What is it?" "I want us to make this official," he said. "Not just as co-parents, but as partners, as a family." Her heart raced, and she stared at him in disbelief. "Ethan, that's a big step." "I know," he said, reaching for her hand. "But I'm ready for it. For you, for them, for all of it." Emma felt tears spill over her cheeks as she nodded. "I think I'm ready too." In that moment, surrounded by the soft laughter of their children and the quiet hum of their home, Ethan and Emma finally let go of the past. Together, they embraced the future, not as two strangers bound by a contract, but as a family united by love and hope. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Ethan Blackwood's penthouse, bathing the room in a warm golden light. The day had finally arrived, a celebration that marked not only the union of two people, but the culmination of a journey that had transformed their lives. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the cufflinks on his crisp white shirt. His hands paused briefly as he stared at his reflection. For a man who once prided himself on keeping emotions at bay, today felt like stepping into uncharted territory. In the room down the hall, Emma Carter sat on the edge of the bed, the soft fabric of her ivory dress draping over her knees. Lily and James, now just over 6 months old, gurgled happily in their playpen nearby. Emma turned to look at them, her heart swelling with a mix of love and disbelief. She had come so far from the woman she'd been when she first met Ethan, a woman whose days were consumed by survival, not hope. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Stephanie, Ethan's trusted assistant and now a close friend to Emma, stepped inside with a warm smile. "Ready?" Stephanie asked, holding up a bouquet of fresh white lilies. Emma took the flowers, her fingers brushing the delicate petals. "I think so," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Stephanie walked over to the playpen, scooping up Lily and James with practiced ease. "Don't worry about a thing," she said. "I'll keep them with me until it's time." Emma nodded, watching as Stephanie left the room with the twins. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling New York City skyline. The city that had once felt so cold and overwhelming now felt like home. The ceremony was held in the penthouse's expansive garden terrace, which had been transformed into an intimate, flower-filled venue. Rows of chairs lined the pathway, filled with a handful of close friends, trusted colleagues, and staff who had become part of Ethan and Emma's unconventional journey. The soft hum of music played in the background, blending with the gentle rustle of the breeze. Ethan stood at the altar, his usually stoic expression softened as he watched Emma step onto the terrace. She moved gracefully down the aisle, her gaze locked on his. In that moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them. When she reached him, Ethan took her hands, his grip firm but tender. The officiant began the ceremony, but Emma barely heard the words. Her focus was entirely on Ethan, on the warmth in his eyes and the unspoken promise that passed between them. When it came time for their vows, Ethan spoke first. He took a deep breath, his usual calm composure replaced by something raw and genuine. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you walked into my life when I thought I had everything figured out. I was wrong. You've shown me that control isn't everything, that love can't be planned or calculated. You've given me a family, a purpose, and a reason to be better every day. I promise to stand by you, to trust you, and to love you in all the ways I never thought I could." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she listened, her heart full. When it was her turn, she squeezed his hands, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Ethan," she said, "you've shown me that even in the darkest times, there's a chance for light. You've given me a home, a family, and the strength to believe in myself again. I promise to trust you, to challenge you, and to love you, even when things aren't perfect. Because this isn't just about us. It's about the life we've built together." The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and as they shared their first kiss, the guests erupted into applause. Stephanie, holding Lily and James in her lap, wiped away tears as the twins giggled, oblivious to the significance of the moment. The reception that followed was simple but joyful. Ethan and Emma spent the evening surrounded by the people who had supported them through their journey. Laughter and conversation filled the air as guests enjoyed the meal, and even Ethan, who once avoided such social gatherings, seemed at ease. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Emma stood on the edge of the terrace, watching the city lights flicker to life. Ethan had one arm wrapped around Emma's waist, while she held Lily in her arms, and James rested against his chest. "This feels surreal," Emma said softly, her gaze fixed on the skyline. "It feels right, Ethan replied, his voice steady. Emma turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. Did you ever imagine your life would turn out like this? Ethan smirked faintly. Not in a million years. But I wouldn't change a thing. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt completely at peace. In the months that followed, their life settled into a new normal. The challenges of raising twins didn't disappear, but they faced them together, with humor, patience, and a growing sense of unity. Ethan continued to surprise Emma with his dedication, not just as a father, but as a partner. He took late-night shifts, attended every pediatric appointment, and even found himself singing lullabies, albeit off-key, to soothe the twins. Emma, in turn, began to explore her passion for art again. With Ethan's encouragement, she set up a small studio in the penthouse, balancing her time between painting and parenting. She found herself thriving in a way she hadn't thought possible, her confidence growing with each passing day. One afternoon, as they watched Lily and James play on a soft mat in the living room, Ethan turned to Emma. "You've changed everything," he said, his voice low but sincere. Emma looked at him, her heart swelling. "So have you?" They shared a quiet smile, the kind that needed no words. Their life wasn't perfect. There were arguments, sleepless nights, and moments of doubt. But it was real, and it was theirs. Together, they had built something stronger than either of them could have imagined. A family rooted in love, trust, and the courage to face the future together. As the twins' laughter filled the room, Ethan and Emma leaned into each other, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Because they weren't just two people bound by circumstance anymore. They were a family in every sense of the word. And that was more than enough. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.